Or if you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 24. This is where we will spend our time today. Paul, as he moves forward in this jurisprudence as a prisoner of Rome, he's now going to get his opportunity to make his defense before Felix. And it's interesting, the accusations that have been leveled against Paul, which he then enumerates his answers to, it's almost as though when he comes before Felix, Felix is in kind of a good mood, and he sort of listens to him. But what I want to focus upon today in looking at this text is the fact that in this moment wherein Paul is making his defense before Felix, he actually brings to Felix the gospel in a very direct fashion. And yet, even within bringing Felix the gospel in this way, Felix is unnerved by it, but he's not moved. I want us to think about that a little bit for ourselves and how that can happen to someone to come that close to the gospel and yet be unmoved. I'll begin reading in chapter 24, verse 10. When Felix the governor motioned for Paul to speak, Paul replied and said, "I know that for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation. So I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 6 days ago, 12, he says, but it's actually 6, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. And they can't prove to you the charges that they're making against me now. However, I admit I do worship the God of our fathers as a follower of this way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that agrees with the law and agrees with the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and people. After an absence of several years, I came back to Jerusalem to bring my people a gift for the poor and to present an offering. I was ceremonially clean. When they found me in the temple doing this, there was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring the charges themselves against me, if they have anything against me to bring. Or these who are here should state what crime they have found me committing when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it is for this one thing that I said, that I stand here concerning the resurrection of the dead, which is the reason I'm on trial before you today." So Paul makes his case. Here's his chance. He stands in front of Felix. He makes this clear reply. He uses a word here that only Paul uses, the word that you see translated cheerfully or happily, that he makes his defense. Tertullus, the lawyer, has listed off all the things that the Sanhedrin are accusing Paul of. And when it says there 12 days Paul had been in Jerusalem, that's true in just the number of days, but 6 of those days he's been in custody. So the point is here, there's not enough time for Paul to have raised up an insurrection against Rome. And that's the only thing they care about. They don't care about this. They don't care about the Jewish law. It's of no concern to them. And you see that in some of the responses they make. And Paul says, look, I had no dispute with anybody in the city. That's true as well. The Jews from Asia are the reason that there's a dispute. These people, everybody's in Jerusalem who's a Jew who can get there for Pentecost. That's why Jerusalem is so filled up. And that's why these Jews who had seen Paul in his missionary journey in Asia, they had come behind Paul. And if you go back and read Acts 21 and along in there, wherein every time Paul appeared in a synagogue and talked about the way, this group of Jews would stir up the crowd and create a riot. They're in Jerusalem now. So when Paul shows up in the temple, they just do the same thing. They stir up a crowd. They said that Paul had defiled the temple. That's one of these charges that is simply a lie. He didn't do that. To defile the temple would have been to have brought Trophimus or one of the other Asian Gentiles into the temple. He didn't do that. And Paul knows, as he says to Felix here, he says, they ought to be here making this case. Why are they not here? He knows that they are the ones to blame for the events. That's why they're not there. He knows that if Felix were to hear them, they would be in trouble. Paul knows that. What I love about what Paul is doing here, and this is something that speaks to me personally in a way that maybe it doesn't speak to anyone else, but I thought I'd share it with you. Paul speaks here with utter integrity. There's nothing here that Paul is saying that can't be demonstrably shown to be true. They could go back and they could trace all of Paul's steps and they would see that everything he is saying is absolutely true. I love it when somebody can stick it to somebody just by telling the truth. Now, maybe that's personal to me, but it's such a beautiful thing when you can just say what happened and you know that the person over there who's making the accusations is being shown more and more and more and more to be some kind of clown because they're not telling the truth and you are. And that's what Paul is doing. As I was reading for this sermon, I read a lot of stuff that's outside the Bible and outside commentaries and things like that. I happened across this article about Michael Jordan. I don't know if I'm sure everybody knows who Michael Jordan is, even if you didn't watch him when he played basketball, which I didn't because I don't like basketball. Or when you're 5'9" and change, you're not very good at it. And so I never enjoyed watching something that I couldn't do anyway. But Michael Jordan, and maybe you just know him through the underwear commercials. Maybe that's how you know Michael Jordan, which is valid. I mean, hey. But Michael Jordan when he played basketball, he always signed a 6-year contract, which in the NBA, that's a very long time. You know, with the kind of pounding a body takes running up and down that wooden court, bodies don't last a long time, and 6-year contract's a long contract. However, what's significant about it is Michael Jordan was if you take all of the statistical measurements for basketball, of course, when points scored per game, points of assist, where you've assisted somebody else in scoring, takeaways, saves, where the ball's going out of bounds, defensive measures, shooting from the free throw line, shooting from the three-point arena, all of that. There are individual measurements where there are other players who are better. There's never been anybody in the history of basketball that's as good at all that as Michael Jordan has been in every sphere. I'm going to say, and I think there's a lot of agreement out there, he's probably the greatest basketball player that's ever lived. I mean, people are still chasing the records. So he, in the NBA, you've seen this in the NFL. You'll see some player who gets really, really, really good in their first or second year of a contract, and what do? The training camp comes and they stay home. Their agent says, you just stay home and make them pay you more. Michael Jordan never did that, and people were amazed. Other players thought, well, what are you doing? You could easily just hold out and get more money. So he was in an interview. I read an interview of him 25 years ago in Rolling Stone magazine. This interview was a sports reporter, and he said, Michael, I've talked to lots of other players, I've talked to other agents, I've talked to people who look at your life and say you were underpaid. You could have held out for money in those 6-year contracts. Now, this is the most incredible answer that he gives. He says, I could have, but I gave my word. I gave my word. I signed that paper with that owner that said, I will play for you these 6 years for this much money. He said, if I had held out for more money, I would be breaking a promise. He said, then how would I train my children to keep their promises had I not kept my promise? I thought, wow. Now, I don't know if Michael Jordan's a believer, but that's an example to anybody as a believer. And you got Paul standing here in front of this group of people. He knows that what he's saying is true. And I can just imagine, here are the Sanhedrin, the high priest, Ananias. They've all traveled to Caesarea, which is a pretty good distance in those days when you went by camel or mule or foot. And it's just like Paul is taking a really dull, hot knife and sticking it in them and turning it around and around because they know that Paul is telling the truth. And the governor Felix kind of knows it too. Now Paul, he could have been, but he's not. He's not defiant. He's not self-pitying here as he just describes what happened. in the temple. I went in there, I took my offering, I brought those 4 guys with me for purification rites. I paid their way. I brought alms to the poor, and these guys came and stirred up this trouble. Why are they not here? And he says, if I'm guilty of anything, I'm guilty of following the Lord, worshiping the God of my fathers after this way, as they called it, wherein Jesus is the Messiah. This must have just been a real stick for Ananias and the rest of the Sanhedrin. It's almost like Paul is piling on. Now I want to carry on with the text here because there's some important things that we could glean from it. And I'm going to begin reading in verse 22. Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Claudius Lysias comes, the commander, I will hear your case further. He ordered that the centurions keep Paul under guard, but he gave Paul freedom and told the centurions to permit Paul's friends to come and see to his needs and to visit him. Several days later, Felix came back, and he brought his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewish, and sent for Paul and listened to Paul frequently as Paul spoke about his faith in Jesus Christ. And as Paul discoursed on righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, Felix became afraid and said, "That's good enough for now, Paul. You can stop now. I'll call for you at a time that's convenient." At the same time, Felix was hoping that Paul was going to give him a bribe in order that Felix could let him go. But he sent for him frequently and spoke with him. When 2 years had gone by, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, the new governor of Judea, because Felix had kept Paul in prison to grant the Jews a favor. So he left Paul there for 2 years in custody. Now, there's a lot going on here. Felix hears this little Jewish guy talk about the resurrection, good living, and the judgment to come. In other words, he's making a case for us all being accountable before God. And Felix, he gives Paul freedom. He doesn't say you got to be chained to the wall while you're here. He says you've got freedom. Your friends can come and go. They can bring stuff to you. Felix is being touched by the message of the gospel as Paul relates it here in this moment. He keeps calling him in to hear him. Brings his wife Drusilla. I can only imagine what kinds of conversations Drusilla and Felix have when they go home after listening to Paul like this time and time again. But it upsets Felix. He becomes stirred by what Paul says. Now, I don't know about any of you in this room, really. I mean, I know everybody, but I don't know you. There are aspects about everybody in this room other than my wife, and even there's stuff I don't know. And you don't know about me, but I can tell you this. I remember hearing the gospel and being stirred in this way that Felix is being stirred. I remember sitting in that church year in and year out and hearing the gospel presented. The fact that I hated church was not the church's fault. It was not. It was a good church, still is. But I remember sitting there and hearing it and thinking to myself, he's talking to me. I've got to get up. I got to walk forward in front of everybody. I've got to surrender something of myself here. And I said, no, I'm going to sit right here. I remember being on the job in Maryland, just become a Christian. I mean, I'm brand new. I don't know anything. I'm right, as you would say in the South, off the turnip truck. And I don't know anything about Christianity. I don't know anything about it except that I've come to Jesus and I've said, forgive me, and you come and live in me. That's really all I knew. And I had heard from people, the book of the Revelation, right? And the end times. They've got movies about it. You've got, that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie even about it, The Last Days. And so here we hear all this stuff and we think, that sounds kind of scary. What's going to happen to me and my family when the world comes to an end? And I used to get questions. Now, why did they think I knew about that? I had just become a believer, and people on the job started to find out that Rip's one of those born-againers, as they used to say to me. And so this guy, this huge guy, his name was, I'm not going to say his name because he still may be alive. Anyway, we called him Bob. because there were 5 Bobs, and so we differentiated amongst the Bobs by giving them different prefixes and suffixes to their name. You know, Bob, Bob, Rob, Bob, Rob, Bob, Bob, Rob, and then just Bob, and Big Bob. And so Bob, you got that many Bobs, what are you going to do? So Bob came to me and said, Rip, that stuff about fire and people being lifted off the earth and everybody being left behind and people getting their heads cut. I mean, is that stuff going to happen like in the book of the Revelation? I didn't know anything. I said, well, it does kind of say all that stuff. He said, you really think that's going to happen? I said, I don't know, maybe. I mean, I kind of think it might, some of it. Wow. And this guy, these construction workers, you'd have to be there. I mean, when you got people that can take cuss words and make a whole paragraph out of it and other people understand what they're saying. I mean, I had a foreman like that. And I knew what he wanted me to do, even though the whole paragraph was cuss words. I knew what he wanted me to go and do on the job. That he was unnerved by these things. Felix is listening to Paul talk about judgment and the afterlife, and he's being unnerved. I mean, let's all be honest here for just a minute within ourselves. Can anybody say they know? Now, I'm not saying we know what the Bible says, I believe it. I believe that, but can anybody say they know what it will be like to leave this world? Can you say you know it? No, we can't say that. None of us crossed that threshold. And nobody's come back except one to tell us what it might be like, right? So there's a sense in which when a person who does not know the gospel at all, they don't believe, and they hear, it reminds them of the fact there's something about this world I do not know, and it's unsettling to me. That's where Felix is. Now, Felix, you got to realize you got Paul, this honest little Jewish guy, just telling it as it happened, and he's got no agendas, right? He's not trying to manipulate the truth. He's not trying to make it out to rationalize it. He's just telling these are the things that happen. And then you got Felix. Felix has got a lot of stuff going on in his mind. First of all, you see in the text that it says, as a favor to the Jews, they left Paul in prison. There's a huge historical element there that the Bible does not give us. Roman history does. What had happened is prior to Paul's arrival in Caesarea, the Jews had created an uprising in Caesarea. Felix was the governor at the time. Felix was the governor at the time the Egyptian led 4,000 Jews out into the wilderness. That's why Claudius thought that Paul was the guy. Felix, in order to quell this uprising, this is all prior to Paul's arrival, he had called in the police, which is what the Romans were to do. You call in the centurions, you call in the guard, they rush in, they stop the riot because the Romans don't like anything that's a riot. Well, Felix gave him a little extra latitude in enforcement. He said, while you're doing this, if you see some rich Jews, just loot their houses. It's okay. I'll look the other way. He gave the Romans permission to do that. Well, you can imagine how the Jewish nation felt about that. And they had reported it back to Rome. Felix is on the hot seat. That's why it says in 2 years he was replaced by Porcius Festus. He got in trouble for this. And he's trying to make the Jews happy by keeping Paul in prison, this troublemaker with the Jewish nation. Look, I'm Felix. I'm keeping this guy back for you. I'm helping you out here. Can you forget about that thing I did just a little while ago? And that's what's going on right now. So Felix has got that going on. He's also got the fact that Felix only cares about Felix. He's saying, how can I manipulate this event so that I look good back in Rome? That's part of what's going on with Felix. All of this, I have some sympathy for Felix. I really do. I really do. I remember what it was like to hear the gospel and just walk away from it and say, no, it's not for me. What is it that allows us to do that? What is it that allows people to come up this close to the gospel, I mean close to it, so that we're unnerved by the truth of it, and yet to walk away from it unchanged. How do we do that? There's part of us here wherein we don't have a problem with the facts of the gospel. We don't have a problem with any of that. We don't have a problem with the history, really. I mean, honestly, we don't have problems with it on an intellectual basis. Our problem is the same problem Felix has. There may be a God, and we may be accountable to him for the way we're living. That's the problem. And maybe there are things in our lives, I mean, I could say this for myself when I was not a believer. Maybe there are things I'm enjoying that I've got to say no to. Isn't it interesting? We talk about salvation. We say salvation is free. That is correct. If a person comes in this room who has just shot somebody, and they are coming in here and they say, I have done something terrible, and I cannot fix it. I want to be forgiven when I stand before the God who I believe exists. Can I be saved? The answer to that question is yes, you can. The thief on the cross is the evidence of that, right? He couldn't fix anything. He's done. He's in real trouble, and now he's suffering the consequences of his trouble. But there he is, and he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, you'll be with me today, this day, in paradise. So there's a sense in which when a person truly asks for that mercy, God will answer that prayer, no matter what they are or what they've done. But when we hold back from the mercy, the reason is not intellectual. It's because we look ahead. You see, salvation is free, but we also realize that once we surrender our lives to him, there are some things that may change in us. We don't have to fix them before we come. Free salvation. But once we're born again, there are things that we're going to have to adjust, and we know it. And so there are lots of people who come that close to the gospel, like Festus, and they say, you know, I'm going to have to give up manipulating this governorship in order that I get ahead. I'm going to have to give up the marital infidelities that I have enjoyed over the years. I'm going to have to give all that up in order to surrender to this gospel. The gospel sounds good to me. I want to be free from sin. I want to stand in front of God clean, but I don't want to give that stuff up to do it. Even though Jesus doesn't ask us to give it up before we come. But we know that when we do, we will be asked for that. The conscience is a powerful thing. It tells us things about ourselves. It tells us things about reality. It tells us that there really is a God. It tells us that there may be something after we leave this world that's real. And it tells us that maybe we need to get that straightened out here and now. It also tells us on the other side of it, maybe I don't want to pay the price to have it. Maybe I'd rather just live as I want to live. And so I pose this question for us in this room as believers. I pose it to myself. Are there things in our lives wherein we know that God is calling us in certain ways to live, but we're not willing because the things we're doing seem more interesting to us than the surrender? That's powerful for me. I don't know how it is for anybody else. If there's a question about anything I've said, you want to pray with me, speak with me after the service, I'll stay as long